August 25th, 1944, 3:47 in the morning. The roads of northern France are completely dark. No streetlights, no moon. Just the faint glow of thousands of headlights stretching as far as the eye can see, disappearing into the fog like a river of ghosts rolling east. Private First Class Johnny Waters sits in the cab of a GMC Jimmy truck. He is somewhere in France. He stopped knowing exactly where hours ago. His eyes burn. His hands, cracked and swollen from gripping the steel wheel, have gone partially numb. Somewhere around midnight, he has not slept in 31 hours. The seat beneath him vibrates with the engine. The cab smells of diesel fuel, axle grease, and dried sweat. The road ahead is broken, cratered by bombs, patched by exhausted engineers, then torn apart again by 1,000 trucks passing over it every single day. But Johnny Waters keeps driving, because 200 miles ahead of him, General George S. Patton's entire Third Army, 500,000 men and 10,000 vehicles, is about to run completely out of gasoline. Here is what the history books almost never tell you about the Second World War. The war in Europe was not won by tanks. It was not won by generals. It was not decided on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies above England or in the ruins of Stalingrad. It was won by trucks. 6,000 trucks, rolling day and night across France on a highway that didn't exist 3 weeks earlier, driven almost entirely by Black American soldiers, men that the United States Army had officially declared unfit for combat. The United States Army believed, officially in writing as military doctrine, that black soldiers lacked the courage, the intelligence, and the physical capability required to fight, so they assigned them to drive trucks instead. What the Army did not understand, what the German High Command would spend months desperately trying to comprehend, was what happens when you put 23,000 determined men on a single road and tell them that everything depends on them. What happened next broke the German war machine, and it shattered every assumption that Nazi racial theory had ever made about black men. This is the Red Ball Express, 83 days of operation, 412,193 tons of supplies delivered, 5,958 trucks rolling simultaneously at peak, and a number that the German High Command could not explain, no matter how many times they ran the calculations. 0. 0 times did Patton's army stop for lack of supplies. Not once, not for a single day. This is the story of how they made the impossible routine, and why almost nobody knows their names. June 6th, 1944, D-Day. After years of planning and months of preparation, the Allied armies stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the liberation of Western Europe. The plan was methodical, careful, based on historical precedent and decades of military doctrine. The Allies would push inland, slowly consolidate their positions, build their supply lines, and then advance eastward in a controlled, sustained offensive. History had other plans. By late July, something happened that military planners hadn't fully accounted for. The German defensive lines in Normandy collapsed, not gradually, not in an orderly retreat. They collapsed completely, and suddenly, the door to France was wide open. General George Patton's Third Army began advancing at speeds that had no precedent in the history of armored warfare. 30 miles per day, 40 miles per day, on some days, 50 miles per day, leaving a trail of bewildered and surrendering German soldiers behind them. And this created a problem that nobody had fully planned for, a problem that, if left unsolved would hand the Germans the time they needed to regroup, reinforce, and turn the greatest military opportunity of the war into a catastrophic Allied defeat. Every Sherman tank in Patton's army burned 5 gallons of fuel for every mile it traveled. On roads, off-road, that number doubled. Every infantry division required 650 tons of supplies every single day just to sustain basic operations. Ammunition, food, water, medical equipment, replacement parts. Patton commanded 12 divisions on a 60-mile front. The daily requirement, 12,000 tons of supplies. Every day, without interruption. Here is the cruel irony that almost ended the war before it could be won. For months before D-Day, Allied air forces executed one of the most successful strategic bombing campaigns in military history. Hundreds of aircraft flew daily missions across northern France, targeting bridges, rail yards, switching stations, and train depots. The objective was to destroy the French railway system, the primary means by which Field Marshal Rommel would reinforce and resupply his coastal defenses after the invasion began. It worked almost perfectly. By D-Day, the French rail network in northern France was in ruins. Rommel couldn't move reinforcements. He couldn't resupply his forward units. The bombing campaign contributed directly to the success of the Normandy landings, but if the railroads were destroyed for the Germans, they were equally destroyed for the Allies. To make the situation worse, the Germans still controlled the major ports of northern France and Belgium, Le Havre and Antwerp, the 2 largest and most critical port facilities on the English Channel coast. Without those ports, the vast majority of Allied supplies had to come over the open invasion beaches on the Normandy coast, a slow and weather-dependent process that was never designed to sustain a full-speed offensive across an entire country. The numbers were staggering. On an average day, Patton's Third Army and General Courtney Hodges' First Army together consumed 800,000 gallons of gasoline. 800,000 gallons every single day. And that was just fuel. Not food, not ammunition, not medical supplies, not the 10,000 other items required to keep an army in motion. By late August 1944, Patton's tanks began grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, not because of terrain, not because of weather, because the fuel simply wasn't arriving fast enough. On August 23, 1944, American logistics commanders held an emergency meeting that would last 38 hours without meaningful sleep. The question on the table was simple and terrifying. How do you supply an army that is moving faster than any army in history across a country whose transportation infrastructure has been systematically destroyed by your own side? The traditional answers were unavailable. Railway transport was non-functional. Aerial supply at this scale was impossible with the aircraft available. Barge transport was limited to specific waterways that didn't reach the front lines. The only option left was trucks. More trucks than had ever been assembled in one place for one purpose in the history of warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayers, the officer tasked with designing the operation, laid out a plan that his colleagues initially thought was logistically impossible. A dedicated one-way highway system stretching from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. 2 parallel routes, one for loaded trucks heading east, one for empty trucks returning west. The entire system running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No civilian traffic, no other military units, no exceptions for anyone. Brigadier General Ewart Plank, who would oversee the operation, made a declaration that became legend among American logistics officers. Let it never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from an old American railroad tradition. Marking priority freight trains with a red ball meant they had the right of way over everything else on the tracks. Faster, more important, unstoppable. In France, in August 1944, the Red Ball Express meant something more fundamental than railroad priority. It meant these supplies reach the front, or the war in Europe is lost. Here is what history has consistently failed to place at the center of this story, where it belongs. Of the 23,000 soldiers who would drive and operate the Red Ball Express, approximately 75% were African American. 3 out of every 4 men on that road were black soldiers serving in a completely segregated army. This was not an accident. This was not a coincidence. This was the direct consequence of official United States Army policy. The Army believed, stated clearly in official military doctrine, that black soldiers lacked the courage, the intelligence, and the psychological stability required for combat. This belief had no basis in evidence. It was rooted entirely in the racial prejudices of the white officers who wrote the doctrine. And it determined the military fate of nearly 700,000 black Americans who served in the U.S. Army during World War II. Because they were deemed unfit for combat, black soldiers were assigned almost exclusively to service and supply roles. They drove trucks, loaded ships, maintained equipment, cooked food, and built roads. All the invisible work that makes an army function and receives almost none of the credit when the army succeeds. Washington Rector, a driver with the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, described the reality with quiet precision. You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise. These were men who could not eat in white restaurants, men who could not sit the front of buses back home in America, men whose country had spent decades telling them that they were inferior, incapable, and untrustworthy. Now their country needed them to save it. And they showed up anyway, not out of naivety, not out of blind patriotism. Many of them showed up because they understood something important, that every mile they drove was proof. Proof that everything the Army said about them was wrong. August 25th, 1944. The Red Ball Express begins operations, 5,958 trucks, all rolling simultaneously on a dedicated highway system that did not exist 3 weeks ago. Take a moment to understand what that number actually means. If you lined up 5,958 trucks bumper to bumper, that single line of vehicles would stretch for 42 miles. That is longer than the island of Manhattan is from end to end, times 6. And every single one of those trucks was moving, loaded with ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and spare parts, heading east toward Patton's front lines at a sustained pace that the German military had calculated was physically impossible to maintain. The route itself was a feat of logistics design. From the supply depots near Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches, loaded trucks rolled east on a dedicated highway, marked every mile with red ball signs, closed to all other traffic, patrolled by military police who had authority to remove anyone who didn't belong there. The round trip covered 686 miles. In 1944, France, on roads that Allied bombing had damaged going in, that German sabotage had destroyed during their retreat, and that 10,000 trucks per day were steadily grinding into rubble. The rules were absolute. No stopping except for fuel and genuine mechanical emergencies. Minimum convoy speed of 25 miles per hour. Any vehicle falling below that was pulled off the road immediately. Military police checkpoints every 50 miles removed any driver who appeared too exhausted to continue safely. In the first 5 days of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered 89,939 tons of supplies to forward depots. 89,000 tons in 5 days. On August 29th, 1944, just 4 days into operation, 132 truck companies, operating 5,958 vehicles, delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour period. That record would stand for the entire 83-day life of the operation. It was never broken, never matched, never approached. To understand what 12,342 tons means in physical terms, that is approximately 24 million pounds of military supplies delivered in one day. Enough ammunition to supply an entire infantry division in combat for 6 weeks. Enough fuel to drive every car in the city of Cincinnati from New York to Los Angeles in one day, by truck, on broken roads through a country still partially occupied by the enemy. German logistics specialists who were later captured and interrogated described their reaction to these numbers with a consistency that is striking. Almost all of them said some version of the same thing. They had multiplied German maximum performance by 3, assumed that was the American ceiling, and were wrong by a factor of 10. The men who drove these trucks operated under conditions that should have made the entire operation collapse within the first week. A standard Red Ball Express round trip from the supply depots near Cherbourg to the forward dumps near Paris and back took between 50 and 72 hours of driving. Drivers were assigned in teams of 2, sharing a single cab. One drove while the other attempted to sleep. Not in a bed, not in a sleeping bag, but in the passenger seat of a 2.5-ton truck, bouncing across damaged French roads at 35 miles per hour. John O'Leary, who served with one of the truck companies, described the pace without sentimentality. Patton wanted us to eat, sleep, and drive, but mainly drive. The trucks themselves were pushed far beyond every design specification. The GMC-CCW, nicknamed the Jimmy, or the Deuce and a Half for its 2.5-ton capacity, was an exceptional vehicle for its era. But it was not designed to run continuously overloaded on destroyed roads with minimal maintenance for weeks on end. Mechanics working alongside the convoys developed a brutal triage system. A broken-down truck had 15 minutes of repair time. If the problem couldn't be fixed in 15 minutes, the vehicle was pushed off the road and left. The convoy didn't stop. The mission didn't stop. Engine governors, the safety devices that limited truck speed to 56 miles per hour, were routinely disabled by mechanics who understood that the operation needed speed more than it needed engine longevity. Tires were run until they disintegrated. In the first month of operation alone, Red Ball trucks consumed 40,000 tires, most of them already recapped and worn before they went on. The old saying among Red Ball drivers was simple: the trucks break, but they don't stop. Accidents were constant and lethal. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel, not from negligence, but from the simple biological impossibility of staying awake for 72 straight hours. Trucks drifted into each other in the darkness. Vehicles hit craters in the road and overturned. Engines overheated and caught fire, sometimes with the cargo still aboard. Fred Reese, a mechanic who worked the road, described watching the loaded trucks from the roadside. They were an incredible crew. They'd have crates of ammunition stacked twice the height of the truck cab, and when they went down the highway, those stacks would sway left and right like they were about to go over. They weren't afraid of anything they couldn't afford to be. And through all of this, the exhaustion, the accidents, the mechanical failures, the constant pressure, these men maintained something that no military doctrine had predicted and no officer had ordered: extraordinary pride in what they were doing. Because they understood in a way that many of the white generals directing the operation did not, exactly what they were proving every mile they drove. From concealed positions along the hills above the Red Ball routes, German reconnaissance units watched the convoys pass and filed reports that reflected growing alarm and bewilderment. A unit from the 116th Division radioed on August 28th. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, no spacing discipline, no blackout measures, estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour, moving east. Americans have abandoned all standard military precaution. This observation was accurate, and it violated everything German military doctrine taught about operating in a combat zone. Running without blackout at night was an invitation to air attack. Continuous columns with no spacing between vehicles presented perfect targets for artillery. The absence of dispersal meant that a single disabled truck could theoretically halt an entire convoy. Yet, the Americans not only didn't suffer the consequences the Germans expected, they seemed completely, aggressively unconcerned about any of it. General Edgar Feuchinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express and filed this report to Army Group B headquarters. The enemy operates a supply system that exists outside the boundaries of our military comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals without pause, around the clock. They make no effort at concealment. They do not disperse. They follow no tactical principle we have ever encountered. This is not military science. This is mass production applied to war. What the Germans were observing and could not understand was the fundamental difference between their own military philosophy and the American approach. German doctrine was built on conservation and precision. You protected your vehicles because replacement parts were scarce. You maintained spacing because your logistics couldn't absorb the losses that came with recklessness. You followed procedure because deviation was dangerous when operating on limited margins. American doctrine, at least as practiced on the Red Ball Express, operated on an entirely different principle: volume, redundancy. If you could absorb a 30% daily vehicle failure rate and still deliver 12,000 tons of supplies, then the 30% failure rate was simply the cost of doing business. Plan for it, build it in, and keep moving. The single element of the Red Ball Express that most completely destroyed German strategic confidence was the fuel situation. The Red Ball Express consumed, for its own operation alone, 300,000 gallons of gasoline every day, just to move, just to keep the trucks running. 300,000 gallons. more than many entire German armies received for all purposes, including combat operations, during the same period. And yet, fuel never ran short, not once. German intelligence had been tracking Allied fuel consumption carefully, and their calculations were mathematically correct. The Americans were burning fuel at a rate that should have exhausted their reserves within weeks. What German intelligence hadn't detected was Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. The Allied engineers had laid fuel pipelines along the floor of the English Channel, running directly from refineries in England to distribution points on the French coast. By September 1944, fuel was flowing through underwater pipes that German naval intelligence hadn't detected, didn't know existed, and had no means of interdicting. A captured German logistics officer described his reaction to learning about the Allied fuel infrastructure. "They have strategic fuel reserves larger than our entire national stockpile. They consume more gasoline, moving gasoline, than we allocate to entire panzer divisions for combat operations. This is not a supply system. It is an industrial civilization operating at full wartime production, pointed at us." By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had established a rhythm that German military science had calculated was impossible to sustain. Convoys departed every 5 minutes from the western terminus. Average convoy, 67 vehicles. Standard load, 5 tons per truck, routinely overloaded to 7. Time to cover, 350 miles one way. 14 hours average. Number of vehicles in motion at any given moment, 5,000. German units along the route began reporting something that their commanders initially dismissed as a psychological effect of combat stress. Ghost convoys. Soldiers heard truck engines in the darkness long after actual convoys had passed. Units reported the sound of hundreds of motors that weren't there. German psychological warfare officers eventually recognized what was happening. The constant, unending sound of American trucks had become so deeply embedded in the auditory memory of German soldiers along the front that they were hearing it when it wasn't present. The Red Ball Express had become psychological warfare without intending to, and American psychological warfare units recognized it too. They began broadcasting recordings of truck engine sounds toward German positions when actual convoys weren't present. German units reported these phantom convoys as real, and morale suffered accordingly. September 15th, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, supreme German commander in the West, sits in his headquarters and reads a comprehensive intelligence briefing on the Red Ball Express. The document has taken his staff 3 weeks to compile. It contains verified numbers, vehicle counts from reconnaissance aircraft, tonnage estimates from captured American documents, fuel consumption figures from intercepted radio traffic. Von Rundstedt reads it twice. Then he summons his senior staff. His words to them were preserved in German military archives and recovered after the war. He said, "Gentlemen, we face something that exists outside the framework of military solution. The Americans have created a logistics system that makes distance irrelevant. Our entire strategy for the defense of the West was built on a single assumption, that any advancing army will eventually outrun its supply lines and be forced to pause. That assumption is no longer valid against this enemy. They have not outrun their supplies. They will not outrun their supplies. We are fighting the last war, and they have invented a new one." His operations officer suggested interdicting the Red Ball routes with the remaining German air power. concentrating the Luftwaffe against the supply convoys to disrupt the flow. Von Rundstedt's response was immediate and devastating in its honesty. With what aircraft? They have 6,000 trucks. If we destroyed 1,000 and we do not have the aircraft to destroy 1,000, they would replace them within a week. To merely match their production rate, we would need to destroy 200 trucks every single day. We do not have 200 aircraft operational in the entire Western Theater. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, put it most directly in his operational report of October 1944. We were not defeated by American tanks. We were not defeated by American aircraft. We were defeated by American trucks. Now we arrive at the center of this story, the part that makes it unlike any other story in the history of the Second World War. The United States Army officially believed that black soldiers were intellectually and physically inferior to white soldiers. This was not whispered prejudice in the lower ranks. This was codified military doctrine written into official policy documents used to justify the systematic exclusion of black Americans from combat roles throughout the war. The belief held that black soldiers lacked courage under fire, that they lacked the cognitive capacity for complex tactical decision-making, that they were fundamentally unsuited for the demands of modern combat, and so they were assigned to drive trucks instead. Let that settle for a moment. The men the Army deemed too inferior to fight were the men the Army needed to win. The men who couldn't eat in white restaurants in America were feeding and fueling the entire Allied advance across Europe. The men who had been systematically excluded from every position of trust, responsibility, and danger were entrusted with the single most critical military responsibility in the Western theater of the war. And they delivered under conditions that broke equipment, broke schedules, and broke the physical endurance of men who thought they knew what hard work was. An armored division commander, a white officer commanding the very tanks that the Red Ball was supplying, was asked about the black drivers after the war. His response has been quoted many times since, because there is no better way to say it. They delivered gas under constant fire. Damned if I'd want their job. They have what it takes. A tank driver with the 5th Armored Division said, "If it wasn't for the Red Ball, we couldn't have moved. They were all black drivers and they delivered in the heat of combat. We'd be sitting in our tanks praying for them to come up with gas." The black community had a name for what these men were fighting for. The WWII campaign, victory over fascism abroad, victory over racism at home. Many Red Ball drivers were deeply aware that every mile they drove, every ton they delivered was evidence. Evidence that the Army's official position on black soldiers was not a measured judgment based on performance. It was a lie. They were fighting racism with truck keys. They were defeating Nazi ideology with a GMC engine and a 686-mile supply route through the ruins of northern France. Nazi racial ideology rested on a specific and detailed claim that black people were cognitively and physically inferior, incapable of technical mastery, unable to exercise initiative or independent judgment, unsuited for complex organizational roles. These claims were not peripheral to Nazi ideology. They were central. They were taught in German schools, published in scientific journals, embedded in military doctrine, and used to justify the racial policies that were, at that very moment, killing millions of people across Europe. Some German prisoners of war were put to work alongside the Red Ball Express loading and unloading trucks under the supervision of black American sergeants and officers. They watched black logistics officers calculate weight distributions and coordinate vehicle routing under time pressure, faster and more accurately than many German engineers had managed in peacetime. They watched black mechanics diagnose and repair complex American truck systems under combat conditions without the equipment they were supposed to have, without the time they needed, and without ever stopping the convoy. They watched black sergeants coordinate operations larger than anything most German colonels had ever managed, with fewer resources, under greater pressure, and with better results. SS racial science publications had spent years constructing elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain why this was impossible. The evidence rolling past them at 35 miles per hour, driven by black men who had crossed an ocean to save a country that treated them as second-class citizens, was impossible to reconcile with that framework. The publications simply stopped mentioning American logistics operations. When the evidence is too overwhelming to deny and too damaging to acknowledge, silence is the only remaining option. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German Blitzkrieg doctrine, the man who more than any other individual had designed the style of armored warfare that had conquered most of Europe, reviewed the Red Ball Express intelligence reports from his headquarters in East Prussia and initially dismissed them as American propaganda. No armored force can advance 60 miles daily for a week, he wrote in a staff assessment. Mechanical failure rates alone make this impossible. These figures represent either deliberate disinformation or fundamental misidentification of enemy unit movements. He was wrong, and by October 1944, Guderian knew he was wrong. The Red Ball Express was officially terminated on November 16, 1944. 83 days of continuous operation. The final accounting: 412,193 tons of supplies delivered, 122 million ton miles covered, an average of 5,958 trucks operating daily, with a peak of 7,000. 23,000 total drivers over the course of the operation. 57 million gallons of fuel consumed by the Express itself. 180,000 tires destroyed. More than 5,000 vehicles abandoned or destroyed beyond repair. Total cost: approximately $100 million in 1944 currency. What those numbers purchased: the liberation of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. 47 German divisions defeated through supply advantage alone. And most significantly, the war in Europe shortened by an estimated 180 days. Every day of the war in the European theater cost the United States $250 million and an average of 300 American lives. The Red Ball Express paid for itself completely, in money, in lives, in everything that matters, within the first week of operation. In 1946, the men of the Red Ball Express came home. They returned to an America that had not changed as much as they had. Segregation still existed. Discrimination was still legal. The country that had needed them desperately 17 months ago still did not recognize them as fully equal citizens, but they carried something with them that could not be taken away: experience. Specifically, experience operating the largest and most complex transportation network in the history of warfare. They had solved problems on the road that no logistics manual had ever addressed, because no logistics manual had ever imagined a situation like the one they had navigated. Veterans of the Red Ball Express founded trucking companies. They designed highway systems. They brought to the civilian world the operational lessons they had learned under fire in France, that volume beats efficiency, that speed beats perfection, that redundancy is not waste, but strategy, and that the most important thing about a delivery system is that it never, under any circumstances, stops. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who, as Supreme Allied Commander, had personally overseen the Red Ball Express and understood better than almost anyone what it had accomplished, championed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, creating the Interstate Highway System. The direct conceptual lineage from the Red Ball Express to the American Interstate Network is well documented by transportation historians. The principles those black soldiers developed on broken French roads in 1944: disperse the vehicles, vary the timing, build in redundancy, never stop moving, make the system unpredictable and therefore resilient, are the foundational principles of every major logistics operation in the world today. Amazon delivers to 150 million addresses. FedEx moves 17 million packages daily. UPS operates 140,000 vehicles worldwide. None of them know the names of the men who first proved that a logistics system built on these principles could do the impossible, but they are all, in ways they would be surprised to learn, driving the descendants of the Red Ball Express. General George S. Patton kept a personal journal throughout the war. He was not a sentimental man. He was not given to public expressions of gratitude toward the men who served under him. He was known for demanding impossible things from people and being surprised when they delivered. But in his private journal, in an entry written after the war had ended, he recorded what he actually believed about the Red Ball Express. These are his words: "The truck drivers of the Red Bull Express deserved as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any combat unit in the European theater. They drove through exhaustion that would have stopped most men, through mechanical failure that would have stopped any other army, through weather that stopped armor. Without them, the Third Army does not move. Without movement, we do not win. It is that simple and that absolute." They were black soldiers mostly, segregated by their own country, discriminated against by the army they served, denied recognition during the war itself, while the men they supplied received medals and parades. But they won this war as surely as any rifleman who ever crossed a beach under fire. History must record this truth. I'm not confident that it will. Patton was right to be uncertain. For decades, the Red Ball Express appeared in footnotes, not chapters. The men who drove it received no parade. No monument was built in their honor during the years when monuments were being built everywhere. Their story was told incompletely, if at all. But the roads of northern France still carry the mark of what they did. The logistics industry that moves everything you eat, wear, and use was shaped by what they figured out. And the war they won, the one that stopped the industrial murder of millions of people across Europe, would not have been won without them. 23,000 men, 75% of them black, every one of them told in some way by their country that they were not enough, every one of them proving every mile they drove that they were more than enough. This is the Last Witness Files. Every story has a last witness. Today, you are one of them.